I lean back as the evening darkens and comes on. A chicken hawk floats over, looking for home. I have wasted my life. I am, of course, joking. This is not a joke. Many of you probably didn't find it funny at all. But a free verse poem, a rather famous and often anthologized one by James Wright. However, like a joke, you'll notice it has what I'm calling here, for lack of any better critical term, a punchline, a declaration that seemingly comes out of nowhere, either making the poem memorable and complete or stunted and prankish. Either way, such a punchline is meant, of course, to be the knockout punch, and like the word punctuation, which shares the same etymological root for piercing a thing, and thus, I suppose, killing it or at least allowing it to breathe, the punchline signals that the poem is indeed over almost as much as the white space that follows. One nearly imagines James Wright, after the poem is over, performing the mic drop. So of the many ways one can read that final line in Lying in a Hammock, I have wasted my life, whether as a neo-Marxist critique of the leisure class, or as an existential epiphany ending in self-disgust, or as Wright himself insisted, a religious statement, or as a sarcastic, casual utterance, most readers probably agree that it attempts to give the poem a memorable shock that it otherwise would not have. Indeed, one could argue that it is the punchline's devastation giving the poem what it needs finally to meet all of the Aristotelian criteria for a unified tragedy and thus a poem. Within it is the peripety, I hope I pronounced that correctly, the change of the kind described from one state of things within the play to its opposite, as when that last line is the only line to report not on the objective world around the idle speaker, but on the speaker's subjective emotional state. It is the only line, as it were, that tells rather than shows. And the discovery, a change from ignorance to knowledge, and thus either love or hate. We must note that a memorable last line isn't in and of itself a punchline. And then the watcher at his pulse took fright. No one believed. They listened at his heart. Little, less, nothing, and that ended it. No more to build on there. And they, since they were not the ones dead, turned to their affairs. Why is this not a punchline poem? It is certainly what we would call a flat line, a cold, nearly stoic report of how the world goes on after one's death, and how a death, when considered this way, is a very insignificant worldly moment. It meets, then, the criteria of being different in tone and of turning our attention, as it were, elsewhere. However, the last line arises naturally and logically and clearly from the plot of and from the elements in tension within the poem. If we recognize the allusion to Macbeth's famous speech in Frost's title, we are prepared even from the start for the poem to be about existential insignificance. Indeed, the flatness and coldness of the last line reminds the reader of Shakespearean tragedies like Hamlet, in which we end not with the major characters, but with the minor characters who go on with their affairs, like Prince Fortinbras. For a work to be, as Aristotle famously writes, a complete action, a tragedy invoking pity or fear, it requires, quote, incidents that occur unexpectedly and at the same time in consequence of one another. Readers who cannot find what I'll sort of call distortive funhouse mirroring in Lying in a Hammock tend to be dismissive, arguing that the punchline undercuts all of the hard work done in the rest of the poem, all that careful paying of attention, so that the final result is, well, a waste of time. The problem, then, might be that Wright's speaker states the obvious, what any old reader of poetry and student of Existentialism 101 already could and should infer, that all our work, all our meticulous observation goes for naught in the end and is waste. And perhaps we think Wright's speaker not only gives the joke, or the poetic thought away, but does so in a delivery too smug and matter-of-fact, like the dropper of the mic. As the critic Charles Altieri writes, the self-deprecating poems, like Lying in a Hammock, tend to become merely exercises in the topos of modesty, because the poems lack sustained irony and turn so much on surprise that the final gesture seems theatrical and pompous, an assertion of self masking as humility. There's nothing that is to clue us early on into what we need these days, what we've needed for self-knowledge perhaps since the Enlightenment. A healthy, though not unhealthy dose of skepticism and doubt. So I go around wondering about the good that I am doing, thinking as I do metaphorically. Does writing poetry have any merit other than what the poet Joshua Mahegan calls, quote, a way to make my narcissism more palatable to others? Is poetry just some form of masturbation, a game a la solitaire, the dying fire in which we all stoke our egos? It makes me wonder, why do we keep writing poetry? Is this all a joke? Why have we wasted our lives? Why must we change them? And then, at the risk of stating the obvious, perhaps too matter-of-factly, our lives abruptly end. But we've seen that coming. Thanks.